What created the United States? Most people would probably say the Declaration of Independence. It is the most famous of the founding documents. It is the most dramatic. It is the one with the soaring language, the break from Britain, and the unforgettable promise that all men are created equal. But the truth is more interesting than that. The United States was not created by one document. It was created by three. The Declaration of Independence announced the nation's birth and explained its purpose. The Constitution built the government that could actually hold the country together. And the Bill of Rights drew a line that power was not allowed to cross. One told Americans why they were free. One told them how they would govern themselves. And one told the government what it could never do. Together, these three documents did not just found a country. They created an argument about liberty, power, equality, and rights that Americans are still living inside today. If you want to understand the United States, you do not just need to know one of these documents. You need to know all three, and why each one had to come after the last. The story begins in 1776, in the middle of a war. The colonies had already been fighting Britain for more than a year. Blood had already been spilled. But even then, many colonists were not fully committed to independence. Breaking from the most powerful empire on earth was an enormous step. So the Declaration of Independence had to do something bigger than announce a rebellion. It had to justify it. That is what Jefferson and the Continental Congress set out to do. The Declaration says that legitimate government rests on the consent of the governed. It says people have natural rights. It says that when government becomes destructive of those rights, the people have the authority to alter or abolish it. That was explosive language. The Declaration was not simply complaining about taxes. It was making a philosophical claim. Government is not sacred. Kings are not sacred. Human equality and human rights come first. Then the document turns to a long list of grievances against King George III. This was not random. The argument was structured almost like a legal case. First came the principles. Then came the evidence. Britain, the Declaration argued, had violated the very purpose of government. And then came the conclusion. The colonies were free and independent states. That is why the Declaration matters so much. It gave the Revolution moral meaning. It transformed a military conflict into a statement of universal principle. But there was one major problem. The Declaration explained why Americans should be free. It did not explain how they were supposed to govern themselves once they had won. After independence, the new nation tried its first form of government under the Articles of Confederation. And it did not work well. The Articles reflected the colony's deep fear of centralized power. Americans had just fought a war against a distant government they believed had abused its authority. So they created a system with a very weak national government. There was no president. There was no national judiciary in the modern sense. Congress had limited power. And most importantly, the national government could not effectively tax, regulate commerce, or compel the states to cooperate. In theory, this protected liberty. In practice, it created disorder. The states often acted like separate countries. Economic conflict broke out between them. The national government struggled with debt. It could not reliably fund itself. It had trouble conducting foreign policy from a position of strength. And events like Shays' Rebellion frightened many leaders who saw how fragile the system really was. The revolution had won independence, but independence alone was not enough. A country also needed structure, authority, and stability. So less than a decade after the Declaration, Americans faced a hard truth. They had escaped one failed system, only to build another. That realization set the stage for one of the most important political experiments in world history. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia officially to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they did something far bigger. They wrote a new constitution. The Constitution was an attempt to solve the central political problem of the age. How do you build a government strong enough to function, but limited enough to remain free? That tension runs through the entire document. The Constitution creates a national government with real power. Congress can tax. Congress can regulate commerce. The executive branch can enforce laws. The judiciary can interpret them. This was a much stronger structure than the Articles had allowed. But the framers were deeply suspicious of concentrated power, so they divided authority in multiple ways. They separated power among three branches. They divided power between national and state governments. They created checks and balances so that selfish ambition would be restrained. This was not a system built on trust in human nature. It was built on skepticism. The framers assumed that power would always try to expand. Their solution was to make government powerful enough to act, but internally divided enough to prevent domination. The Constitution also begins with one of the most important phrases in American history: "We, the people." That phrase signaled a major shift. The new government would not rest on a king, a hereditary class, or a loose alliance of states. It would claim legitimacy from the people themselves, at least in theory, because here too there was a contradiction. The Constitution created a more durable republic, but it did not resolve the deepest injustice in American life: slavery. In some ways it protected it. So even as the Constitution strengthened the nation, it left a moral crisis embedded inside it. Still, the Constitution gave the United States something the Declaration never could: an operating system for self-government. But many Americans were not satisfied, because a stronger government was useful. It was also dangerous. When the Constitution was proposed, it sparked fierce debate. Supporters, known as Federalists, argued that the new system was necessary. The country needed order, credibility, and national strength. Opponents, known as Anti-Federalists, feared that the Constitution gave too much power to the central government and not enough protection to individual liberty. This debate led to one of the most important additions in American history: the Bill of Rights. Added in 1791 as the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights did not create the government. It limited it. This distinction matters. The First Amendment protects religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. The Fourth protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth and Sixth establish protections for the accused. The Eighth limits cruel and unusual punishment. And the Ninth and Tenth make clear that rights and powers do not begin and end with the federal government's written list. In other words, the Bill of Rights was a warning label attached to power. It said, "Yes, we are creating a stronger national government. But there are lines it cannot cross. There are freedoms it cannot cancel. There are spaces of conscience, expression, and due process that belong to the people." If the Declaration gave America its ideals and the Constitution gave it structure, the Bill of Rights gave ordinary citizens a shield. At this point, you can see that these documents are not repeating each other. Each one does a different job. The Declaration of Independence is about principle. It answers the question, why should this country exist? Its answer is that human beings have rights, that legitimate government depends on consent, and that liberty can justify revolution. The Constitution is about structure. It answers the question, how should this country govern itself? Its answer is through institutions, separated powers, elections, federalism, and law. The Bill of Rights is about limits. It answers the question, what must government never be allowed to do? Its answer is that even democratic government must be restrained, because power is always dangerous. This is why all three documents matter. A nation cannot live on ideals alone. A nation cannot survive on structure alone. And a nation cannot remain free without limits on power. The United States needed all three. Put these documents together, and you get the full architecture of the American experiment. The Declaration provides the moral claim. The Constitution provides the machinery, the Bill of Rights provides the boundaries. Or to put it another way, the Declaration says people have rights. The Constitution says here is the government. The Bill of Rights says here is what that government may not do. That is a remarkably powerful sequence. First comes meaning, then comes power, then comes restraint, and that sequence reveals something essential about the American founding. The founders were not only trying to build a state, they were trying to solve a paradox. How do you create enough power to preserve a nation without destroying the liberty that made the nation worth creating in the first place? That tension has never gone away. In fact, much of American history can be understood as a struggle over how to interpret these three documents together. Which matters most in a crisis? Liberty or order? Equality or tradition? National power or local control? Broad rights or narrow readings? The arguments change, but the framework remains. That is why these documents are not just historical artifacts. They are living foundations. More than 2 centuries later, Americans still return to these three documents because the questions they ask are permanent. What are human beings owed by government? What gives political power legitimacy? How strong should government be? What rights are so fundamental that no majority should be allowed to take them away? Those are not 18th century questions. They are human questions, and the American answer was never contained in a single text. It was written across 3. The Declaration of Independence gave the country its creed. The Constitution gave it a durable framework. The Bill of Rights gave citizens protection from the very government they had created. Together, they made the United States possible, but they also left the nation with a permanent responsibility: to keep asking whether America is actually living up to the principles it claimed, the system it designed, and the liberties it promised. That may be the deepest lesson of all. The United States was not created by force alone, or by victory alone, or by one dramatic moment in Philadelphia. It was created by ideas written down, argued over, revised, defended, and handed forward. The Declaration of Independence explained why Americans believed they had the right to be free. The Constitution created the structure of a government capable of surviving, and the Bill of Rights protected the people from the dangers of the very power they had established. Together, these documents created not just a nation, but a continuing debate about liberty, equality, power, and rights. That debate is still unfinished, and perhaps that is the final truth hidden inside these founding texts. America was never meant to be held together by force alone. It was meant to be held together by principles, institutions, and liberties working in tension with one another. 3 documents, 1 country, and one of the most ambitious political experiments in human history.